La Llorona del Valle. Prologue. The Curse at Bass Lake. The waters of Bass Lake glistened under the pale moonlight, still and silent as if bracing for what was to come. San Juana Maria Cortez sat in a fragile wooden boat, her hands and feet bound, heavy stones tied to her ankles. Around her, the townspeople of Oakhurst gathered on another vessel, their voices harsh with accusations. They called her a murderer, a woman so consumed by grief that she had drowned her 6 children. But the truth burned within her. Her husband, Manuel Ortega, had betrayed her, sinking the boat while their children slept. Yet Manuel's lies and charm had turned the town against her, condemning her as the monster. As the small boat sank, the icy water began to crawl up her legs. The crowd hurled stones at her, ensuring the vessel would submerge faster. Through her gag, San Juana screamed, her voice rising above the splashes. "This town will never know peace. Your children will suffer as mine have. Your bloodlines will drown in sorrow." Her wail echoed across the lake, silencing even the most bitter townsfolk. The water claimed her, pulling her into its depths. For a moment the lake's surface was still, but then a chill spread through the air. The curse had begun. Chapter 1. A Life of Struggle. The small farm near Bass Lake was a humble sanctuary, where Santiago Cruz and his wife, San Juana Maria Cortez, built a life of quiet dignity. The land, passed down through generations, was just enough to sustain their family of 8. Crops grew in modest rows, their bounty a testament to the couple's tireless work. At the heart of it all was San Juana, a woman whose beauty seemed untouched by the hardships of her life. Her skin, sun-kissed and smooth, glowed with a warmth that seemed to mirror the golden hues of the California sun. Long, raven-black hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, often tied with a simple ribbon as she moved gracefully through the fields. Her dark, chocolate-colored eyes shimmered with kindness and strength, holding a depth that could calm even the most restless of hearts. Her high cheekbones and softly curved lips gave her a serene, almost angelic quality. But it was not just her features that made her beautiful. It was the quiet grace with which she carried herself, the steadfast love she poured into every corner of her life. San Juana's voice was gentle but firm, a melody of reassurance and guidance for her 6 children. Whether she was soothing a crying infant or instructing her eldest son on how to plow a field, her words carried the strength of a mother's devotion. To her family, she was not just a caregiver, she was their anchor, their light in the face of struggle. Santiago Cruz was her equal in every way, a strong and patient man whose laughter filled the modest adobe home they shared. His hands were calloused from years of trapping and farming, but they were also gentle as they caressed her face or helped their youngest daughter learn to walk. The day Santiago left for the woods, rifle slung over his shoulder, was no different from any other. He kissed San Juana softly, his fingers brushing against her cheek as he promised to return before sundown. But that evening, as the shadows grew long and the children grew restless, he didn't return. The news came with the urgency of a neighbor's hurried steps. Santiago had fallen into a ravine while checking his traps. His injuries had been too severe, and he had passed before help could arrive. The farm, once filled with laughter and warmth, grew quiet. Santiago was buried beneath the old oak tree, the children's sobs mingling with their mothers as they said their final goodbyes. San Juana stood apart, her angelic face streaked with tears, her grief too profound for words. After Santiago's death, San Juana's once bright beauty took on an air of quiet sorrow. She rose before dawn each day, her graceful hands blistered from tending the fields and mending the family's meager belongings. Her strength was undeniable, but the strain of running the farm alone while raising 6 children began to show. Yet even in her moments of exhaustion, San Juana's beauty remained. Neighbors often remarked that she looked like a saint, a figure carved by God himself to endure and inspire. Her faith became her refuge. Every night she knelt before a small altar adorned with a wooden cross, her dark eyes glistening as she prayed for strength. Her whispered prayers were filled with gratitude for what little she had, and a plea for guidance in the face of unrelenting hardship. The farm, however, grew more difficult to sustain. The droughts scorched the crops, the cow's milk dwindled, and her children grew thinner with each passing week. San Juana began to wonder if her prayers were enough. It was during one of these desperate moments that Manuel Ortega arrived, a man who would change her life forever. Chapter 2. The Man with Promises. The first time Manuel Ortega came to San Juana's farm, it was as though he had stepped out of a dream. Standing tall and broad-shouldered in the golden light of late afternoon, he looked like a figure carved from the very earth he claimed to seek gold within. His sun-bronzed skin glowed with health, his dark eyes sharp and alive with cunning. Manuel wore his confidence like armor. His crisp white shirt and polished boots spoke of a man who had left hardship behind, and the crimson silk scarf around his neck hinted at a flair for drama. His wide-brimmed hat shaded his chiseled face, but it couldn't hide the easy smile that curled his full lips. When he spoke, his deep, honeyed voice wrapped around his words like a spell, making them linger in the air. "I saw your fence was broken on my way into town," he said, tipping his hat. "Let me help you with that. It'd be a shame to see such a fine farm fall to ruin." San Juana hesitated at first. She had grown wary of strangers since Santiago's death, her angelic features hardened by the weight of her responsibilities. But there was something about Manuel's presence, his charm, his warmth, that made her want to believe in him. Over the next few days, Manuel became a fixture on the farm. He repaired the fence, mended a leaking roof, and even helped the children plant new seeds in the parched soil. The older children adored him, drawn to his stories of adventure and fortune in the mountains. The younger ones giggled as he carved them small wooden animals, his laughter as infectious as their own. San Juana watched him from the porch, her dark eyes filled with cautious hope. For the first time in months, the farm felt lighter, the oppressive weight of her grief and struggle lifting in Manuel's presence. "You don't have to do this alone," Manuel told her one evening, his voice low and smooth. They stood near the old oak tree where Santiago was buried, the setting sun casting long shadows across the land. His eyes, dark and intense, held hers. "A woman like you deserves more than just survival. I can give you a better life, for you and the children." San Juana's heart ached at his words. She wanted to believe him, to trust that his promises were genuine. Her children needed stability, and she longed for a partner who could shoulder the burdens she carried alone. When Manuel proposed, it felt like a lifeline. He spoke of a future where the farm would thrive, where her children would want for nothing, and where she could finally rest. Desperation and hope clouded her judgment, and she accepted, convinced that Manuel was the answer to her prayers. The wedding was a quiet affair, held under the oak tree with her children as witnesses. Manuel looked every bit the part of a devoted husband, his polished boots and wide smile painting a picture of prosperity. For a time it seemed as though Manuel had delivered on his promises. He worked the farm with vigor, laughing with the children and doting on San Juana. The neighbors, seeing her smile return, whispered that perhaps she had found her second chance. But Manuel's charm was a mask, and it wasn't long before the cracks began to show. Manuel's absences grew longer, his excuses thinner. He claimed he was prospecting for gold in the mountains, returning with stories of his endeavors and the occasional nugget as proof. But the stories began to contradict themselves, and the nuggets were revealed to be borrowed trinkets. San Juana's unease deepened when she heard the whispers in town. Manuel was no prospector. He was a gambler and hustler, leaving behind debts and broken promises wherever he went. Worse still, there were rumors of other families, wives and children scattered across the San Joaquin Valley. When a neighbor confirmed seeing Manuel at a gambling den in Fresno, San Juana confronted him. Her voice trembled with anger as she demanded the truth. Manuel didn't deny the accusations. Instead, he laughed, his dark eyes cold and unfeeling. "You have everything you need," he said, his tone dismissive. "Stop worrying about what I do when I'm away." San Juana's hands clenched at her sides, her angelic features hardened by fury. She wanted to throw him out, to protect her children from the web of lies he had spun. But her hope, that fragile thread she clung to, kept her silent. She told herself she could endure his flaws for the sake of her children. But Manuel Ortega was a man who thrived on destruction, and his promises of a better life would soon crumble into ashes. Chapter 3. Lies Unveiled. The longer Manuel Ortega stayed, the more San Juana began to notice the cracks in his polished veneer. At first they were small, a forgotten promise here, a suspicious absence there. But soon the cracks deepened, exposing the rot beneath his charming facade. Manuel's absences grew longer, and his explanations grew more elaborate. He claimed he was prospecting in the mountains, chasing a vein of gold that would finally deliver the fortune he had promised. Yet whenever he returned, his hands were conspicuously clean, and his pockets suspiciously empty. At first, San Juana chose to believe him, clinging to the hope that he was working for their future. But as weeks stretched into months, whispers began to reach her ears. "He's no prospector," one neighbor confided, her voice low and hesitant. "I saw him in Fresno, at one of those gambling dens." San Juana's heart sank, but she dismissed it, unwilling to confront the possibility that Manuel had deceived her. But the whispers continued, growing louder and more damning. One evening, as San Juana stood at the edge of the farm watching the sun set behind the hills, another neighbor approached with news that shattered her fragile hope. "San Juana," the woman began, her face pale with unease. "I didn't know how to tell you, but Manuel, he has other families. I heard from a cousin in Merced. He's married there too. And there are children." San Juana's breath caught in her throat. The words felt like a blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Later that night, when Manuel returned with his usual swagger and easy smile, she confronted him. Her voice, trembling with anger and hurt, demanded the truth. "Is it true, Manuel? Are there others? Are you nothing but a gambler and a liar?" Manuel's response was as cold as it was dismissive. "What does it matter? You have what you need. The farm is still standing, isn't it?" San Juana's fury burned hotter. "You promised us a better life. You promised my children." "And they have one," Manuel interrupted, his voice rising. "Do you think anyone else would have stayed? You should be grateful for what I've done." For the sake of her children, San Juana bit back the words she longed to say. Manuel's temper was sharp, and the cracks in their fragile family were already too wide. Manuel, sensing the tension, attempted to smooth things over with empty promises. "I'll change," he said one morning, his tone unconvincing. "I've got one last opportunity, a real one. After this, everything will be different." But Manuel's idea of opportunity was a dangerous gamble. In truth, he had hustled a man in a game of cards and won a small boat as his prize. It wasn't wealth, but it was enough to spin another web of lies. "Let's take the children out on the water," Manuel suggested one evening, his tone unusually cheerful. "A family trip. They deserve it." San Juana hesitated. Something about his sudden enthusiasm felt off. But the children, unaware of the storm brewing beneath their parents' relationship, were thrilled at the idea. Against her better judgment, San Juana agreed. The night of the trip, the lake was serene, the water reflecting the stars like glass. The children laughed and played as the boat drifted, their joy a brief balm for San Juana's troubled heart. Manuel played the role of the doting father, his deep voice telling stories of brave adventurers and hidden treasures. For a moment, San Juana allowed herself to believe in the illusion, to imagine a life where Manuel's promises weren't lies. But as the family settled into sleep, lulled by the gentle rocking of the boat, Manuel set his plan into motion. In the dead of night, Manuel sabotaged the vessel. Weighted sacks hidden beneath the floor ensured the boat would sink. Water began to seep in, slowly at first, then faster as the hull gave way. San Juana awoke to the sound of her youngest child crying, her heart leaping in panic as she realized the boat was sinking. "Manuel!" she screamed, searching for him in the chaos. But he was gone, leaving her to face the nightmare alone. The children clung to her, their tiny hands grasping desperately as the cold water rose around them. She fought to keep them afloat, but the lake was relentless. One by one they slipped from her grasp, their cries silenced by the water. By the time dawn broke, San Juana was the only survivor, clinging to a piece of debris as she drifted toward the shore. Her heart was shattered, her soul consumed by grief. When she reached the town of Oakhurst, drenched and delirious, she told the sheriff everything. But Manuel, ever the liar, had already woven a different story. He claimed that San Juana had drowned the children in a fit of madness, overcome by the weight of her responsibilities. The town, swayed by Manuel's charm and San Juana's grief-stricken state, turned against her. Her trial was swift, and her punishment cruel. Bound and weighed down with stones, San Juana was sent back to the lake, her cries ignored by the people who once called her neighbor. As the boat began to sink, her voice rose in a final, anguished wail. "This town will never know peace. Your children will suffer as mine have. Your bloodlines will drown in sorrow." The water swallowed her, and the lake grew still. But the air around Oakhurst grew colder, as if the valley itself had taken notice. The curse had begun. Chapter 4. The Curse Takes Hold. The night after San Juana sank into the waters of Bass Lake, the valley seemed to hold its breath. An eerie stillness fell over Oakhurst, a silence so deep that even the wind refused to stir the trees. By midnight, the first signs of her curse began to spread, a presence born of grief and wrath taking root in the land. From the lake, a thick fog began to rise, curling through the woods and creeping into the town. It smothered the streets and snaked around homes, lingering where children slept. The air grew colder wherever the fog passed, its chill unnatural and unsettling. Some claimed to see figures within it, small shadows moving in the mist, the shapes of children with outstretched hands. Others swore they felt eyes watching them, though no one was there. By dawn, the fog dissipated, but it left behind an unshakable sense of dread. It wasn't a natural fog. It moved with purpose, as if carrying a message from the lake. A week later, the weeping began. At first it was faint, a soft sobbing that drifted on the night air. But as the nights passed, the cries grew louder and more anguished, filling the valley with an unbearable sorrow. "Mis hijos, dónde están mis hijos?" The mournful wails echoed through the town, rising from the lake, the rivers, and even the wells. It was as though the water itself carried her grief, spreading it far and wide. Those who heard her cries spoke of an oppressive sadness that pressed on their hearts, as if her despair had seeped into their very souls. Families tried to block out the sound, covering their windows and doors, but the voice always found them. Her sorrow had become inescapable. And then the children began to disappear. At first it seemed like accidents. A boy wandered too close to the lake and was never seen again. A girl left to fetch water and didn't return. But as the pattern became clear, fear gripped the town. Wet footprints were found in the children's rooms, trailing from their beds to the water's edge. The prints always stopped abruptly, as if the lake had swallowed them whole. On the nights when children vanished, parents reported hearing faint laughter outside, followed by splashes that faded into silence. No bodies were ever recovered, and no one could explain the disappearances. The townsfolk began to speak of the lake as if it were alive, as if it had become an extension of San Juana's sorrow. Her curse spread beyond the lake, carried by the waterways of the valley. Farmers working late near the irrigation canals heard her cries, their lanterns flickering as her voice echoed through the darkness. Families drawing water from wells whispered of sobbing rising from the depths, a sound that lingered long after they fled. The San Joaquin River became another vessel for her grief, its waters carrying her voice to neighboring towns. Oakhurst began to wither under the weight of the curse. Families fled, abandoning their homes and farms, unwilling to risk their children's lives. The streets grew empty, and the once thriving town became a place of whispers and fear. Those who stayed lived in constant dread, locking their doors at sunset and praying for mercy that never came. In desperation, the townsfolk built a shrine near Bass Lake. They left offerings of toys, flowers, and food, hoping to appease La Llorona del Valle. But her cries continued, her sorrow unyielding. On the anniversary of her death, the town held vigils, lighting candles and pleading for forgiveness. Yet the fog always returned, thicker and colder with each passing year. Though the townsfolk attributed the curse to San Juana's grief, its power was rooted in something far older. Her grandmother, Jimena, had taught her that water carried memory, holding the echoes of pain and prayers. San Juana's final tears, shed as the lake swallowed her, turned Bass Lake into a vessel for her sorrow. The Aztec goddess Chalchiuhtlicue, known for her dual nature of nurturing life and exacting vengeance, seemed to answer San Juana's cries. The lake became a weapon, claiming the children of those who had wronged her. San Juana's sorrow, amplified by the betrayal she suffered, transformed her into the La Llorona del Valle. Her curse was no longer just a mother's grief. It was a reckoning, a force that bound itself to the valley and grew stronger with each life it claimed. The people of Oakhurst learned too late that her sorrow was eternal, a shadow that would never leave their land. Her cries would haunt them for generations, her presence a chilling reminder of the injustice that had sealed their fate. Chapter 5. The Vanishing Children. The first disappearance seemed like a tragic accident. A young boy named Mateo wandered too close to Bass Lake at dusk, his small figure last seen skipping stones along the shore. His parents searched frantically, calling his name as they scoured the water's edge, but there was no sign of him. The only trace he left behind was a single muddy footprint near the lake. The town mourned Mateo, their grief tinged with unease. The lake, always a source of sustenance and calm, now seemed darker, its waters holding secrets no one dared to voice. When a second child vanished days later, the whispers began to grow louder. Maria, a bright-eyed girl of 8, had been sent by her mother to fetch water from the family's well. She never returned. Her mother found the empty bucket lying on its side, with wet footprints leading away from the well. The tracks stopped abruptly, as though Maria had disappeared into the very air. Night after night, the disappearances continued. The youngest and most innocent were the first to go, their laughter and footsteps replaced by eerie silence. Parents would wake to find their children's beds empty, the blankets still warm. Wet footprints, trailing from their rooms to the nearest water source, were the only evidence of their departure. Strange phenomena began to accompany these vanishings. Some families reported hearing faint laughter outside their homes, the sound light and joyful, like children playing in the yard. Others spoke of a soft, mournful voice calling out, "Mis hijos," just before the fog thickened and the children were gone. The voice was both haunting and hypnotic, luring children into the night as though they were sleepwalking. One evening, the Delgado twins, Elena and Esteban, were taken. Their mother, Rosa, had been on edge for weeks, haunted by the sound of crying outside her home. She had placed a crucifix above their bed and burned a candle through the night, praying for protection. Exhaustion eventually claimed her, and she drifted into a restless sleep. When Rosa awoke, the house was eerily quiet. She rushed to the twins' room, her heart pounding, and found their bed empty. The crucifix lay face down on the floor, the candle extinguished. Outside, 2 sets of wet footprints led into the fog. Rosa screamed their names, running after the fading prints, but the dense mist swallowed her cries. By morning, the footprints had vanished, and the twins were gone. Bass Lake, once a tranquil centerpiece of Oakhurst life, had transformed into a place of terror. Its waters seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though it had become a living thing. Search parties ventured into the woods and dragged the lake's edges, but no trace of the children was ever found. The water hid its secrets well. Fishermen avoided the lake altogether. Those who ventured too close swore they saw small hands reaching up from the depths, disappearing just as quickly as they appeared. One man claimed to hear laughter beneath the water's surface, faint and distorted, as though carried from another world. With each disappearance, the curse's grip on Oakhurst tightened. The once vibrant town grew quiet, its streets hollowed out by fear. Families began to flee, abandoning their homes and fields to seek safety elsewhere. Those who stayed behind lived in constant dread, locking their doors at sunset and keeping their children close. The church overflowed every Sunday. the pews packed with desperate prayers for salvation. But even the priest, a man who had weathered decades of hardship, admitted that the curse seemed beyond the reach of heaven. He told one grieving father, his voice low and trembling, "Water carries the soul, and this lake carries her rage." The curse spread far beyond Bass Lake. The waterways of the San Joaquin Valley carried San Juana's sorrow like a ripple, reaching distant farms and towns. Farmers working late at night near the irrigation canals heard her cries, their lanterns flickering before going out entirely. Mothers drawing water from wells whispered of sobbing rising from the depths. The San Joaquin River, winding its way through the valley, became another conduit for her grief. Fishermen along its banks reported an unnatural chill in the water, even in the heat of summer. Parents warned their children to stay away from the river at night, but the warnings didn't always work. The valley's children grew up with stories of La Llorona del Valle. Parents told them to stay indoors after dark, to ignore the laughter, and to never answer the cries of a woman calling for her children. Yet, no matter how careful they were, the curse found a way. San Juana's vengeance was relentless. The lake had become her domain, the fog her veil, and the children of the valley her eternal offering. Chapter 6. A Valley in Mourning. By the time the first year of the curse had passed, Oakhurst was a shadow of its former self. The streets, once alive with the bustle of families and farmers, grew empty as fear gripped the town. Windows were shuttered, doors locked tight, and homes abandoned by those unwilling to risk their children's lives. The lake, once a place of solace and sustenance, now loomed like a dark, unspoken threat. Its waters, cold and impenetrable, became a forbidden place. The fog that rolled in nightly from its surface seemed to carry whispers, a mournful voice that called out to the living. "Mis hijos." No one dared venture near the lake after sunset, yet its presence was inescapable. The stories of La Llorona del Valle spread beyond Oakhurst, carried on the voices of travelers and the fearful whispers of neighbors. The waterways of the San Joaquin Valley became extensions of the curse, spreading its shadow far and wide. Farmers tending to the irrigation canals late at night reported hearing cries that seemed to rise from the water itself. Lanterns would flicker and extinguish as the cries grew louder, leaving the workers alone in the darkness with only the sound of their own quickening breath. In neighboring towns, mothers spoke of hearing sobs when drawing water from their wells. Some claimed to hear their own children's names whispered in the night, soft and sorrowful, as though San Juana's grief had reached beyond the lake to claim more lives. The San Joaquin River, a lifeline for so many, became a source of fear. Fishermen refused to cast their lines near certain bends in the river, claiming the water felt colder than it should, even in the heat of summer. They whispered of pale faces glimpsed beneath the surface, gone before they could be sure of what they'd seen. Oakhurst's church became the heart of the town's resistance against the curse. Every Sunday, its pews overflowed with families desperate for salvation. Mothers held their children tightly, and fathers knelt in prayer, pleading for protection. The priest, a man whose faith had guided the town for decades, was not immune to the weight of the curse. His sermons grew quieter, his hands trembling as he lit candles and offered blessings. "The lake has been claimed," he admitted to a grieving mother one evening. "We cannot fight what it has become." But the people of Oakhurst were determined to try. A shrine was erected near Bass Lake, a desperate attempt to appease the spirit that haunted it. The townspeople brought offerings, toys, flowers, food, tokens of peace and apology for the lives lost. They lit candles at the water's edge and whispered prayers, their voices trembling in the cold night air. The shrine became a focal point of the town's grief, a place where mourning parents left small trinkets for their missing children. Yet the offerings seemed to go unnoticed. The fog still came each night, heavier and colder, and San Juana's cries continued to echo across the valley. On the anniversary of San Juana's death, the remaining townsfolk gathered at the lake for a vigil. They lit candles and placed them along the shoreline, their flickering light reflecting on the still waters. The priest led the group in prayer, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. But as midnight approached, the fog began to rise. It coiled around the candles, snuffing out their light, and rolled toward the crowd. The air grew icy, and the cries began again. Mis hijos. ¿Dónde están mis hijos? The townspeople fled, their fear overwhelming their resolve. By morning, the shoreline was empty, save for the scattered remains of the offerings. The shrine stood silent, its purpose seemingly ignored by the force it sought to placate. San Juana's sorrow had transformed into something far greater than grief. It was an unrelenting presence, a force bound to the land and the water. Though the townspeople had tried to appease her, her pain could not be soothed. Her curse had become eternal. It flowed through every stream, every canal, and every drop of water in the valley, reaching further with each passing year. The stories of La Llorona del Valle became warnings whispered from one generation to the next, a tale of sorrow and vengeance that could not be undone. The valley had become her domain, its people her unwilling witnesses, and the children, her eternal offering, were her silent proof that injustice could never be drowned. Chapter 7. A Descendant's Confrontation. Isabel Cruz stood at the edge of Bass Lake, her heart pounding as she stared into the fog that veiled its dark waters. Her hands trembled as she clutched a wooden cross blessed by the priest, its smooth surface warm from her grip. Somewhere beneath those waters lay the answers to a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. San Juana had taken her child, Mateo, her sweet laughing boy who loved the stories of heroes and monsters. She had heard the tales her entire life, the warnings passed down about La Llorona del Valle. She had dismissed them as myth until the night Mateo disappeared. Now, she stood here, knowing that the spirit who had stolen her son was her own ancestor, bound to her by blood and tragedy. The thought churned in her mind, a mix of sorrow and fury. Part of her wanted vengeance, to lash out at the woman who had claimed her child. But another part, the part shaped by her mother's whispered prayers and her grandmother's bedtime stories, understood the depth of San Juana's pain. Isabel wasn't just here for herself. She was here to stop the cycle, to spare another mother the agony she now carried. "You took him from me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I won't let you take anyone else." The fog thickened as Isabel waded into the icy water, its chill biting through her clothes and seeping into her bones. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the lake resisted her approach. "Tia San Juana," she called, her voice trembling but firm. "I know what happened to you. I know your pain, but this has to end." The mournful cries began to rise, soft at first, then louder, reverberating through the air like a storm rolling in. "Mis hijos. ¿Dónde están mis hijos?" The voice pierced Isabel's heart, the grief in it so raw that it nearly brought her to her knees. The cries stopped abruptly, replaced by an unnatural silence. From the fog, a figure began to emerge, pale and otherworldly. San Juana's ghostly form seemed both solid and ephemeral, her long black hair flowing around her like ink in water. Her dark eyes were hollow, streaked with golden tears that glimmered as they fell. Her tattered white dress clung to her frame, and the cold emanating from her was palpable. "Why have you come?" San Juana asked, her voice a mix of sorrow and accusation. Isabel swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to meet the spirit's gaze. "You took my son," she said, her voice shaking. "You took Mateo. But I'm not here for vengeance. I'm here to stop this, to stop you from taking another mother's child." San Juana's expression flickered, her form trembling as though the fog itself was holding her together. "I lost them," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They were all I had. I couldn't save them." "And neither could I," Isabel said, tears streaming down her face. "I failed him too. But this pain, this vengeance, it isn't what they would want. Your children loved you. They wouldn't want you to take others." San Juana's hands, trembling and translucent, reached toward Isabel. Her hollow eyes filled with conflict, anger, sorrow, and a flicker of something softer, something human. "I have nothing else," San Juana said, her voice raw. You have peace, Isabel replied, holding out the cross. You just have to let yourself find it. Let them find it. San Juana hesitated, her fingers brushing the cross. Her form flickered again, shifting between the vengeful spirit and the woman she had once been. With a final mournful cry, she took the cross, her tears shimmering like sunlight on water. Her body began to dissolve, fading into the lake as the fog began to lift. For a brief moment, Isabel felt relief. The weight that had pressed on her chest lifted, and the air grew warmer. But as the last of San Juana's form disappeared into the water, the lake stirred, its surface rippling unnaturally. From the depths, shapes began to rise, figures that did not belong to this world. They were the old gods of Mexico, their forms both majestic and terrifying. Chalchiuhtlicue, her flowing robes made of liquid jade, stared at Isabel with eyes like deep, endless pools. Mictēcacihuātl, the skeletal queen of the underworld, stood silently beside her, her hollow gaze piercing through Isabel's soul. Coatlicue, adorned in her skirt of serpents and necklace of human hearts, loomed above them all, her presence immense and suffocating. Their fury was palpable, their eyes burning with judgment. These were the deities who had answered San Juana's cries, who had lent their power to her curse. Now, their work was undone. Isabel froze, her breath caught in her throat as their gaze bore into her. For a moment, it felt as though the weight of their wrath would crush her. But then, as the fog continued to fade, so did they. One by one, the gods dissolved into the mist, leaving only the rippling water in their wake. Isabel collapsed onto the shore, trembling and gasping for air. The cries were gone, the fog lifted, but the memory of those divine figures burned in her mind. She had stopped San Juana, but the gods had made their presence known. They had been watching, and their departure did not feel like forgiveness. It felt like a warning. As dawn broke over Bass Lake, Isabel whispered a quiet prayer for Mateo and for San Juana's children. The water was calm now, reflecting the rising sun like a mirror. Yet the memory of what had happened lingered, a reminder that some forces, though unseen, were always watching. Though the curse had been lifted, the lake and its waters remained a place of reverence and fear. The gods had receded into the fog, but their shadows would forever haunt the valley,